If you went to school in Britain, you already know Berol, even if you never knew the name, the fat red handwriting pen from the pot on the table, the pencil you learned your letters with, the smell of cedar curling off a freshly sharpened point. For decades, that pen and that pencil were made on an estate on the edge of King's Lynn, in Norfolk, and shipped by the million to nearly every primary school in the land. The company had crossed an ocean to get there. It had survived 2 world wars, turning from pencils to secret war work and back. It had survived the move out of London and the coming of the biro and the felt tip, every threat the century could throw at a firm that made things to write with. And then, after nearly a century of making pens and pencils in Britain, the Norfolk works fell silent. How does the pen that taught a whole country to write lose the place that made it? Chapter 1. The pen in your hand. Somewhere in your house, there is probably still one. A fat pen with a red barrel and a black cap, the plastic slightly grooved at the top where some child once held it in their teeth. Or a pencil, hexagonal, the paint worn to a shine at the spot where thumb met forefinger through 1,000 spelling tests. You didn't choose it. It was handed to you. It came from a pot on a classroom table, and it was the thing you learned to write with. For a generation of British children, that pen had a name, though most of them never thought of it as a name at all. It was just what a school pen was, a Berol. The ritual is the same in the memory of almost everyone who sat in a British primary classroom from the 1980s onwards. First you wrote in pencil. Then, one day, if your letters were neat enough and your teacher was satisfied, you were granted a pen license, the right to put down the pencil and pick up the pen. And the pen you picked up, more often than not, was a red Berol handwriting pen, pulled from a communal pot, its cap chewed by whoever had it last. There was a luck to it. Some of the pens in the pot were fresh and ran wet and glorious across the page. Others had been left uncapped and had dried to a scratchy, spitting nothing. You learned very quickly to reach for a good one. The ink was washable, which is why a whole generation of parents remember blue smears on school jumpers that mostly came out in the wash. The cap had a little vent hole in the top, a quiet piece of design meant to stop a child choking if they swallowed it. And the barrel was that particular red. Not a bright red, a slightly muted institutional red. The red of a thing made to be bought by the gross for schools that could not afford to be sentimental. Here is the strange part. The company that made that pen, the company whose name became a common noun in 1 million classrooms, was not really British at all. It was founded in New York in 1856 by a German immigrant named Daniel Berolsheimer. And the factory that made the pens and pencils Britain grew up with, the vast humming works that turned out those objects by the million, stood not in London, not in Birmingham, but on an industrial estate on the edge of a Norfolk market town that most people, if they are honest, would struggle to find on a map. King's Lynn. That factory is gone now. It closed more than 20 years ago. The pens are still sold. You can still buy a red Berol handwriting pen today. But they are made somewhere else, imported, the Norfolk works, long since emptied and carved up into trade units. The name every British child learned to write with survived. The hands that made it did not. This is the story of how that happened. Not a story of a single villain, however much the shape of it might tempt you to look for one. A quieter, sadder story than that. The story of a family firm that became a line in a much larger ledger, and of a Norfolk town that had the making of the nation's pencils for 36 years. And then didn't. To understand how it ended in King's Lynn, you have to begin somewhere else entirely, in a small town in Bavaria, in the middle of the 19th century, where the pencils came from wood, and the men who cut it were about to cross an ocean. Chapter 2. The Berolsheimers of Fürth. The town of Fürth sits just outside Nuremberg in Franconia, in the German south. In the 1850s, it was a place of small workshops and family trades, and among those trades was pencil making. The land nearby had the graphite, the forests had the wood, and the Berolsheimer family were pencil people. In 1855, a man named Daniel Berolsheimer went into partnership with a relation, Leopold Ilfelder, and together they built a steam-powered pencil factory in Fürth. Steam was the modern thing then, the difference between a workshop and an industry, and for a family that had made pencils by hand, a steam factory was a statement of ambition, but Daniel Berolsheimer had a larger ambition still. He was looking west. The following year, in 1856, he crossed the Atlantic and set himself up in New York. He took a shop on John Street, in the crowded commercial heart of Lower Manhattan, and he called his new venture the Eagle Pencil Company. The name was not an accident. According to the company's own account, the eagle and the name were chosen to stand for the newfound freedom the family had discovered in the United States. The immigrant's declaration, stamped on the side of a pencil, that here was a man who had arrived and meant to stay. He built a factory up the Hudson at Yonkers, and he began to make pencils the American way, at scale, for a country that was growing faster than any in the world and needed something to write with. The business passed down through the family, as these businesses did, to Daniel's son, Heinrich, to others of the line, Emil and Philip among them, each generation taking the eagle a little further. It is easy, from here, to forget how modern the pencil once was. We think of it as an old, humble, almost primitive object, a stick of wood. But in the 19th century, the mass-produced pencil was a piece of high technology, the cheap and reliable tool that put writing into the hands of ordinary people, that armed the clerk and the schoolchild and the engineer's drawing board. A firm that could make good pencils in enormous numbers was a firm at the leading edge of its age. The Berolsheimers were not making trinkets. They were making one of the instruments on which the literate, record-keeping, self-improving 19th century actually ran. And they were very good at it. And here the family did something that would matter, though no one could have known it at the time. It split. One branch stayed in the east with Eagle. Another went west. A Berolsheimer named Charles struck out for California and in time bought a company called California Cedar Products, a firm that to this day is one of the great suppliers of the incense cedar slats from which pencils the world over are cut. The wood itself, in other words, ran in the family. One branch made the pencils. The other, eventually, grew the trees. The Eastern Eagle, meanwhile, was becoming something more than American. In 1894, the company opened an office and showrooms in London, feeling out a market across the ocean, and by the end of 1907, Eagle was no longer just selling pencils in Britain. It was making them there, in a factory at Tottenham, in North London, under its own English roof. That is the thing to hold on to, because it is where the whole later tragedy is seeded. The company that would one day be mourned as a lost piece of British industry was, from the very start, an American firm founded by a German immigrant. It became British by making things in Britain, by employing British workers, by putting down roots in British towns, by threading itself so deeply into British childhood that people forgot it had ever been anything else. That was the achievement, and it was real. A thing does not have to be born in a place to belong to it. The name that Britain would come to know did not arrive until much later. For more than a century, the pencils carried the eagle, and the family name sat behind the business rather than on the product. It was only in 1969 that someone made the decision to put the family on the label, and even then, not the whole of it. They took the surname, Berolsheimer, and they cut it in half. They kept the front. Berol, not a place, not a Latin word for something fine or lasting. Just the first two syllables of a German immigrant's name, shortened for the side of a pen. But that is to get ahead of ourselves. Before Berol could become the brand that taught Britain to write, it had to leave London, and it had to find its way to the Fens. Chapter 3. From Tottenham to the Fens. For most of the first half of the 20th century, the story of the company in Britain was the story of Tottenham. The Eagle Works there grew into a serious industrial concern. By the 1920s, the firm was advertising itself at the British Industries Fair as the largest manufacturer of its kind in the world, and listing among its customers His Majesty's Stationery Office, colonial and foreign governments, and schools. That last word matters. Schools. From very early on, this was a company that understood the value of the child's desk. Win the classroom and you win a customer for the length of a life, and then the customer's children after them. The war interrupted everything, as it interrupted every British works. During the Second World War, the Tottenham factory turned away from pencils and toward what the record calls, carefully, secret military equipment. The lines that had made writing instruments made other things instead, and did not speak of them. Pencil making did not resume properly until 1946, when the country came back to peace and to paper, and children came back to school needing something to write with. Then, in the 1960s, came the move that would define the rest of the story. The company decided to build a new, purpose-designed factory, and it chose not London, but Norfolk. In 1967, a modern pen and pencil works opened on the Hardwick industrial estate on the edge of King's Lynn. There was a logic to it that had nothing to do with pencils and everything to do with policy. King's Lynn in that era was a designated expansion town, one of the places chosen to absorb population and industry moving out of an overcrowded London. Towns like Lynn were offered growth, firms like Eagle were offered land and space and a workforce. It was the great post-war bargain of British planning. Take your factory out of the capital, and here is somewhere to put it. For a Norfolk town more used to the rhythms of the port and the surrounding farmland, the arrival of a modern manufacturing employer was a genuine event. Somewhere for a school leaver to go on a Monday morning that wasn't the fields or the fish. King's Lynn had been a great town once, centuries before, a medieval port on the Wash, its wealth built on wool and wine and the long trade with the Low Countries. Its quaysides and merchant houses a reminder of a prosperity that had drifted away with the centuries. By the 1960s, it was a working town of modest ambitions, proud and slightly overlooked, the kind of place that London planners thought of, when they thought of it at all, as somewhere with room. Into that town came a factory that made something clean and modern and useful, and the town took the work gladly. This was not a company parachuting in to exploit cheap hands. It was, for a generation, a fair exchange. The town gave the firm its labour, and the firm gave the town a reason for a certain number of its people to stay. The changes came quickly after that. In 1969, the company put the family name on the brand and became Berol, and in 1978 it went further still. It moved its head office to King's Lynn. This was no longer a London firm with a Norfolk outpost. The centre of gravity had shifted. A market town in the Fens was now the headquarters of a company selling pens and pencils around the world. And what a range it sold. There were the wooden pencils, Venus, Murado, names that generations of draftsmen and schoolchildren knew by feel. There were the verithin-coloured pencils, prized for a fine, hard point that held its edge. There was the Charisma range, Charisma Colour, the European cousin of the American artist's pencils, a professional's tool that would find its way into art schools and studios across the continent. There were fibre-tip pens and markers in every colour, and there was the object at the heart of it all, the one that would outlast the memory of the factory itself, the Berol handwriting pen. Its timing was extraordinary. In the late 1980s and into the 1990s, English primary schools were shifting how they taught children to write, moving toward joined-up, continuous cursive, the looping hand that ties one letter to the next. That shift needed the right tool. It needed a pen that ran smoothly, that suited a small hand still learning control, that could survive being dropped, chewed and left uncapped in a communal pot. Berol had exactly that pen and a school's sales operation that had been courting British classrooms since before the war. The company did not simply sell into a market. It arrived at the precise moment the market was being built, holding the thing the market needed. For a while in there, and no one inside those walls would have called it this at the time, King's Lynn had caught the wave perfectly. The factory was busy, the lorries went out full, and on the Hardwick estate, in a low modern building that smelled of cedar and lacquer and ink, several hundred Norfolk men and women came in every morning to make the tools a nation of children would learn on. To understand what was lost, you have to go inside, onto the floor, and watch how a pencil was made. Chapter 4. Inside the Works. A wooden pencil is one of the most ordinary objects in the world, and one of the most quietly ingenious. It looks like a single thing. It is not. It is a small sandwich of wood and graphite, assembled with a precision that the person chewing the end of it never has cause to think about. And at King's Lynn, that assembly ran under one roof, from raw material to finished, stamped, boxed product. It began, as it must, with the core, the part everyone wrongly calls the lead, though there has never been any lead in a pencil. The writing core is graphite, ground fine and mixed with clay and water into a stiff, dark paste. The ratio of clay to graphite is the whole secret of the thing. More clay and the pencil writes harder and paler. Less clay, and it writes softer and blacker. That is what the letters and numbers on the side of a pencil mean. The H's and the B's, the 2B and the 4H, a code for how much clay went into the mix. The paste was forced through a die, extruded into long, thin spaghetti strands of soft core, cut to length, dried, and then fired in a kiln at a heat that drove off the last of the water and left the core hard enough to write with, but soft enough not to shatter. While the cores were being made, the wood was being prepared alongside them. Incense cedar, straight-grained and soft and sweet-smelling, cut into thin slats. A machine cut a set of parallel grooves along each slat, like the furrows in a tiny field. The cores were laid into the grooves of one grooved slat. A second grooved slat, glued, was laid on top, sandwiching the cores between two halves of wood. Clamped and left to set, this became a solid block, a plank with pencil cores running through it, like the lead in a stick of rock. Then the block was fed through shaped cutters that sliced it apart lengthways and, in the same pass, rounded or hexagoned the edges, so that a single block of wood surrendered a whole row of individual pencils, each with its core running dead center. From there, the raw pencils moved to the lacquer lines, where they were coated. Several times, coat after coat, until the wood was sealed under a smooth skin of color. It is the lacquer that gives a pencil its gloss and its snap of color. A well-made pencil might carry 6 or 7 coats, each one thin, each one dried before the next went on. Only then came the imprinting, the foil stamping of the name engraved onto the barrel. This was often where the human eye came in closest. Lines of workers, many of them local women who had done the work for years and could do it faster than any newcomer believed possible, fed and watched and sorted, catching the pencil whose stamp had smudged, the barrel whose lacquer had run, and at the end, for those pencils that were to have them, the ferrule was crimped on, the little metal band at the top, and the eraser pressed into place. The pens were their own operation. The handwriting pen had to be assembled, its nib set, its reservoir filled with that particular washable ink, its vented cap fitted, and the whole thing sealed and boxed. Ink has its own smell, sharper than the wood, and its own mess. Inkline workers knew their fingers would carry a faint stain home no matter how careful they were. The building had a smell that the people who worked there never forgot, because it was the smell of years of their lives. Cedar, first and above everything. That sweet, resinous, unmistakable scent of cut pencil wood. The smell of a freshly sharpened pencil multiplied 10,000-fold and hanging in the air of an entire factory. Under it, the sharper tang of lacquer and solvent from the coating lines. And threaded through the pen shop, the chemical bite of ink. Cedar dust settled on everything, fine as flour. Graphite worked its way into the creases of hands and stayed there. It was warm work and repetitive work, and, for the town, it was good work. Steady, indoor, paid, in a place where steady indoor paid work was not to be taken for granted. Out the far end went the product. Boxes and gross packs and cartons of it. Pencils and pens by the 100,000, by the million, loaded onto lorries in the Norfolk car park and driven out through the flat fenland light toward the schools and shops and stationery cupboards of the entire country. A child in a classroom in Cornwall or Cumbria or the far north of Scotland, reaching into a pot for a red pen. That pen had come from here, from a low building on the edge of King's Lynn, made by people whose names that child would never know. Think for a moment about what that volume actually means on a factory floor. A single primary school might get through hundreds of pencils and dozens of pens in a year, chewed and lost and worn down to stubs. Multiply that by every primary school in the country, then by the secondary schools, the offices, the newsagents, the export markets, across the Commonwealth and the continent. The arithmetic runs into the millions, and every one of those millions started as a paste of graphite and clay and a slat of cedar, and passed through this one building, and through the hands of the people who worked in it. There is a particular dignity in that kind of work, invisible, endlessly repeated, and quietly essential. The people on the King's Lynn lines were not making anything anyone would put in a museum. They were making the thing a 5-year-old would hold the first time they wrote their own name. It is hard to think of a more intimate industrial product than that, and most of the people who used it never gave a second's thought to where it came from. Why would they? That is exactly how a thing becomes essential. It disappears into the ordinary. Chapter 5. The brand that taught Britain to write. It is one thing to make a good pencil. It is another to become the pencil, the default, the assumed, the one whose name a whole country reaches for without thinking. Berol managed the second thing, and it managed it most completely in the one place that mattered most for the long game. The classroom. The company's roots in the school's trade went back, through Eagle, to those pre-war advertisements naming His Majesty's stationery office and schools among its customers. By the time it was headquartered in King's Lynn, Berol was not merely selling to British education, it was woven into it. The catalogues that landed on the desks of school business managers listed Berol as a matter of course. The handwriting pen was described, in the language of the school's market, as designed specifically for children learning to write, and it was bought that way in bulk by the gross, term after term, year after year, by schools that reordered without ever pausing to consider an alternative, because there was, in any way that counted, no alternative. That is how a brand becomes a common noun, not through advertising, or not mainly, through ubiquity so total that the word for the object and the name of the maker quietly become the same word. Ask anyone schooled in Britain from the 1980s on what they wrote with, and a great many of them will not say a pen. They will say a Berol. They may not know it was a company. They may never have wondered where it came from, or who made it, or whether the people who made it still had jobs. It was simply the pen. Like a biro or a hoover, the trade name had eaten the thing itself. And the affection was real, in the way that affection for the objects of childhood is always real. Half about the object and half about the child you were when you held it. The pen pot on the table. The pen license, earned and announced. A small graduation. The luck of the draw between a good pen and a dried one. The smell of the ink. The blue on the cuff. These are not marketing achievements. They are memories, and the company had, almost by accident, embedded itself inside millions of them. Beyond the classroom, the range earned a different kind of loyalty. The Charisma-colour pencils became a genuine favourite among artists, a staple of the coloured pencil world across Britain and Europe, valued for the quality of the pigment and the smoothness of the laydown. This was the professional end of the operation, the proof that King's Lynn could make not just the schoolroom workhorse, but the tool a working artist would choose and defend. And the export trade carried the Norfolk output well beyond Britain, the schools of the old Commonwealth, the stationery markets of the continent, the long reach that the Eagle had been building since 1856. There is a quiet business genius buried in the school's model, and it is worth understanding because it is also, in the end, part of what made the factory vulnerable. A pencil is cheap. A pen is cheap. Nobody gets rich on a single sale. The money is in the reorder, in the fact that every pencil is used up, every pen dries out or is lost, and every September a school opens its stationery cupboard and finds it needs to fill the pots again. Berol had built, over decades, a position where filling those pots without thinking meant buying Berol. That is an enormously valuable thing to own, but it is valuable as a brand and a customer relationship. And a brand and a customer relationship can be honoured from anywhere. They do not require, in any strict commercial sense, a factory in Norfolk. The schools would reorder the red pen whether the red pen was made in King's Lynn or made on the other side of the world. That truth sat quietly inside the success, waiting. In the golden age, nobody looked at it. There was no reason to. The pens were made in Norfolk because they had always been made in Norfolk, and the lorries went out full, and the schools reordered, and that was simply how the world was arranged. Inside the works, the daily life of the place had the texture of any good British factory of the age. There were shifts and shift changes. There were the people who had been there years, and the school leavers just starting. There was organised labour on the site, as there was in most manufacturing of the period, and the ordinary machinery of a working community, the canteen, the friendships, the marriages that started on the line, the sons and daughters who followed parents in through the gate. It was, for hundreds of families in and around King's Lynn, simply where you worked. Not glamorous, not famous. The town did not define itself by Berol the way a pit village defined itself by the pit. But it was there, and it was solid, and on a Friday it produced a wage packet, and a wage packet built a life. That was the shape of the thing at its best. A modern factory in a Norfolk town, making an object of quiet national importance, selling it into every school in the land, and to artists across a continent, employing local people in steady numbers, its name so common that it had stopped being a name. If you had walked the floor in the early 1990s, breathed the cedar, watched the lorries load, you would have been forgiven for thinking this was a settled and permanent thing. A fixture, like the pen in the pot. It was about to become more important than it had ever been. And that, as it turned out, was the beginning of the end. Chapter 6. King's Lynn, capital of pencils, In February 1992, the old Tottenham factory, the North London works where Eagle had made pencils since before the First World War, closed its doors. Nearly a century of London pencil making came to an end, and its production did not vanish. It was consolidated, moved, gathered up and carried to the one place now equipped to hold it, King's Lynn. This was the summit. With Tottenham gone, the Norfolk works became the heart of the whole British operation, the place where the pencils were made, the pens assembled, the head office sat, the lorries loaded. Everything the company was in Britain now ran through a single building on the Hardwick Industrial Estate. The workforce at Lynn was at its largest. The car park was full. The cedar smell was at its strongest, because there had never been more pencils moving through the place. If there was ever a moment to call King's Lynn the capital of British pencils, this was it. The range was at its widest, too. The handwriting pen was riding the great wave of primary school cursive. The Charisma-colour pencils were at their European peak, in art rooms and studios across the continent. There were bright new lines aimed at children, the sort of loud, fun, felt-tip ranges that filled a 1990s pencil case. The catalogue was thick. The brand was everywhere. To anyone standing in that car park watching a loaded lorry pull out toward the schools of Britain, it would have looked like a company at the top of its powers. And it was. But the thing about a summit is that you can only stand on it for a moment, and the thing about this particular summit is that the ground had already shifted beneath it in a way that no one on the factory floor could see. Because the family had gone. Not recently. Years before. Back in 1986, the last of the line to run the business, Chairman Kenneth Berol, had announced that the family intended to sell. There was no sixth generation coming. No Berolsheimer waiting to take the Eagle into another century. And so, in 1987, the company was sold, not to a British firm, to the Empire Pencil Corporation of Tennessee, an American pencil company buying an American-founded pencil company, whatever the address of its factories. Take a moment to feel where that places us. At the very instant that King's Lynn became the beating heart of Berol, the moment the Norfolk works reached its peak, its fullest car park, its widest range, its greatest importance, the people whose name was on the pens had already sold up and walked away. The town did not know it was making pencils for a company that was now simply one holding in a distant portfolio. The workers loading those lorries in 1992 were the employees of an owner most of them had never heard of, in a state most of them would never see. The pencils were the same. The cedar smelled the same. The pen still came out of the pot the same muted red. Nothing on the floor had changed. But the hands on the controls, the ones that would decide whether King's Lynn had a future, were no longer the family's, and no longer even really the company's own. They belonged to a boardroom, and boardrooms answer to a different question than the one a factory floor asks. A factory floor asks, are the pencils good? Are the lorries full? Do the schools reorder? A boardroom asks a colder question. It asks whether this is the best place to make the pencils at all. For now, in 1992, the answer was still yes. The consolidation of Tottenham into Lynn was itself a vote of confidence. The moment the company decided that if British pencils were to be made anywhere, they would be made in Norfolk. The factory was efficient. The workforce was skilled. The product was excellent and the demand was there. On every measure that a factory floor understands, King's Lynn had earned its future. And for a few more years it would keep it. But there is a kind of vulnerability that comes precisely at the moment of triumph, and it is this. When you have consolidated everything into one place, you have also made one decision able to end everything. Tottenham was gone. There was no second British works to fall back on. The whole of Berol's British making now sat in a single building, owned by an American corporation, dependent on that corporation's continued judgment that Norfolk was the right place for it. As long as that judgment held, all was well. The moment it changed, there would be nowhere else for the work to go, except away. The clock on Norfolk pencil making had started ticking. It had, in truth, started ticking in 1987, in a boardroom the workers never saw. It was just that, in 1992, standing at the top, breathing the cedar, watching the lorries roll out full toward every classroom in the country, nobody at King's Lynn could yet hear it. Chapter 7. Sold up. The end of a family firm rarely arrives as a disaster. More often it arrives as a sensible decision, taken reluctantly by people who can see no better option. That is how it came to Berol. In 1986, the chairman, Kenneth Berol, announced that the family intended to sell the company. The reason he gave was the oldest one in family business. There was no sixth generation to take it on. The line that ran back through Emil and Philip and Heinrich to Daniel Berolsheimer, the immigrant who had crossed the Atlantic with an eagle in his head, had simply come to its natural end. No heir wanted the pencils, and a family firm without an heir is a clock running down. Rather than let it wind to a halt, Kenneth Berol chose to sell while the company was strong. The buyer, in 1987, was the Empire Pencil Corporation of Tennessee. There is a particular sorrow in selling a thing from strength. A firm sold in crisis is a rescue. Everyone understands it, and no one mourns the loss of independence because there was no independence left to lose. But Berol was not in crisis in 1987. It was healthy, respected, profitable, its pens in every classroom in the land. Kenneth Berol was not selling wreckage. He was selling a going concern in good order, handing over something that worked, precisely because there was no one of his own blood left to hand it to. It was the responsible thing to do, and the sad thing, and both at once. 130 years of family pencil making, from a steam factory in Fürth to a modern works in Norfolk, came to an end not in failure, but in the simple absence of a child who wanted it. Empire Pencil was itself no small concern. It was one of the largest pencil makers in the United States, a serious industrial operation in its own right, and its purchase of Berol made a certain kind of sense. Pencil company buys pencil company, consolidating the trade on both sides of the Atlantic. For the workers at King's Lynn, an American owner who at least understood pencils was not the worst thing that could happen. Empire knew what a good factory looked like. For a few years, under Tennessee's ownership, the Norfolk works carried on much as it had, making what it had always made, its new distance from the center of things not yet a threat. Hold that year in your mind, because it matters more than almost any other in this story, and because it is the year that the popular version of events forgets. When people picture the moment a beloved British firm was swallowed by an American giant, they tend to picture the mid-1990s. They are wrong by nearly a decade. By 1987, Berol was already American-owned. It was one American pencil company, Empire, buying another American-founded pencil company, whatever the address on its factory gates. The King's Lynn works carried on exactly as before, the same cedar, the same red pens, the same lorries. But the ownership had crossed the ocean, quietly, years before anyone in Norfolk had reason to notice. For a while, under Empire, little changed on the floor. But the direction of travel had been set. King's Lynn was no longer the centre of anything. It was now an asset. A good asset. A productive one. But an asset all the same, held by owners who measured it against other assets on the far side of an ocean. And then came the takeover that everyone does remember, the one the whole story is usually hung upon. In 1995, the Newell Company acquired the Berol Corporation and placed it within a division called Sanford. It is worth being precise about what Newell was, because the imprecision is where the legend takes root. In 1995, it was the Newell Company, not yet the household-scale conglomerate it would shortly become. It would not take the name Newell Rubbermaid until March 1999, after it paid something in the order of $6 billion to swallow the Rubbermaid Corporation whole. But even in 1995, Newell's strategy was unmistakable, and Sanford was the instrument of it. Sanford's ambition was to assemble the writing instruments of the world under one corporate roof. Sharpie markers, Papermate pens. In time, Parker, Waterman, Rotring, Reynolds. And now Berol, the pencil that taught Britain to write, filed alongside the rest as one more brand in a growing portfolio. Newell had a reputation in American business for exactly this, for buying good brands and then remaking them in its own efficient image, absorbing them so completely into its systems and its cost disciplines that the process had earned its own grim nickname among people who followed such things. The company was a machine for acquisition and integration. It did not buy Berol because it loved pencils. It bought Berol because Berol was a strong brand with a loyal customer base and a settled place in the market, and strong brands were what the machine consumed. What happened to the factory afterwards was a separate question, to be answered later by the arithmetic. The logic of a portfolio is not the logic of a factory. A factory wants to make the best possible product in the place it has always made it. A A portfolio wants to make each product wherever it can be made most cheaply and efficiently, and it feels no particular loyalty to any single town. From the moment Berol entered Sandford, King's Lynn was competing, silently, without ever being told, against every other place in the world where a pen or a pencil could be manufactured. The first sign of what that would mean came not to the schoolroom pen, but to the artist's pencil. The Charismacolor range, that European favourite made in Norfolk and prized across the continent, had its production moved to the United States after 1995. It was an early, quiet subtraction, a piece of the King's Lynn story lifted out and carried across the Atlantic, years before the factory itself came into question. The Charismacolor pencils would limp on under the new arrangement and finally be discontinued in 2005, a small extinction that most people never noticed. But for anyone at King's Lynn paying attention, it was a message written in the plainest possible hand. Work could leave. Work had already left. The only question that remained was how much and how soon. The family had gone in 1987. The independents had gone in 1995. What was left in King's Lynn was a very good factory, full of skilled people, making an excellent product for a distant owner who would, sooner or later, ask the cold question that all portfolios ask. Chapter 8. A line on a spreadsheet. To understand what happened to King's Lynn, you have to understand the scale of the thing it now belonged to, because that scale is the whole explanation. It is not a story of malice. It is a story of arithmetic, performed at an altitude from which a Norfolk factory is simply too small to see. When Newell became Newell Rubbermaid in 1999, the pencil business that Daniel Berolsheimer had founded in a shop on John Street became a minor line in the accounts of a corporation with billions of dollars in sales and a portfolio spanning cookware, hair accessories, window blinds, and paint rollers. Berol was not important to Newell Rubbermaid. It could not be. In a company that size, no single heritage stationery brand could be. And a factory in King's Lynn, employing a few hundred people making pencils, was a rounding error, a line item on a spreadsheet compiled by people who had never smelled the cedar and never would. In 2001, a new chief executive took charge of Newell Rubbermaid. His name was Joseph Galley Jr., and he arrived with a reputation forged at the American toolmaker Black & Decker and, briefly, at Amazon. Galley was a cost man, a restructurer, the kind of executive brought in precisely to look hard at a sprawling portfolio and decide what stayed, what went, and what could be made somewhere cheaper. He singled out Sandford, the writing instruments division, as one part of the empire ready for growth. Growth, in the language of that kind of leadership, does not mean keeping every factory open. It means concentrating production, cutting duplication, and driving down the cost of each unit made. It means consolidation. This was the climate of the age, and King's Lynn had the misfortune to be a small English factory inside a large American company at exactly the moment that companies of that kind were learning to think of manufacturing as something footloose, something that need not stay anywhere in particular, that could be picked up and set down wherever the numbers were best. The pension liabilities of an aging British workforce, the cost of a Norfolk site, the sheer number of separate plants a global division had inherited through years of acquisition, all of it went into the calculation. And the calculation had no column for cedar in the air, or for a woman who had run the same machine for 20 years, or for what a factory meant to the town that had grown up around it. Those things are real. They are simply not the kind of real that appears on a spreadsheet, and consolidation was already gathering pace around King's Lynn in a way that would prove bitterly relevant. At the very end of 2000, weeks before Galley took the top job, Newell Rubbermaid had bought the writing instruments division of the Gillette Company, and with it, Parker, Waterman, Papermate, and liquid paper. Parker, the most famous pen name in Britain, made at a factory in Newhaven, on the East Sussex coast. Now Parker and Berol sat inside the same division of the same American conglomerate, two proud British writing brands reduced to neighbouring entries in a single portfolio. Two factories, two loyal workforces, and a corporate owner whose instinct and whose chief executive's explicit purpose was to have fewer of both. When a company owns two factories doing broadly similar things in the same country, it does not, as a rule, keep both indefinitely. That is not cruelty. It is the plainest arithmetic there is. Two sites carry two sets of overheads, two management teams, two lots of heating and rates and maintenance, to do work that might be squeezed, with enough effort, into fewer walls. Somewhere in the offices of Sanford, someone was looking at a map of the division's British and European manufacturing and seeing not communities, but redundancy, in the technical sense, the sense of duplication. And redundancy, once seen, tends to get removed. The decision, when it came in 2003. Newell Rubbermaid would close the King's Lynn factory. 230 people would lose their jobs, and the work that had been done in Norfolk would be dispersed. Here we must be careful and honest, because this is exactly the point at which the story is usually told wrongly. The comforting, furious version says the Americans shut King's Lynn and shipped the work to China, that they bought a British brand purely to gut it and offshore it to the cheapest factory in the world. It is a satisfying story. It fits everything we already believe about what was done to British manufacturing. And in the case of King's Lynn, it is not what happened. The King's Lynn work did not sail to China. It went up the A roads. Some of it was transferred to a Newell Rubbermaid factory at Lichfield, in Staffordshire, and some of it went to the former Parker Pen factory at Newhaven, in East Sussex, both of them in England, both of them within the same corporate family. That is not to say the offshoring instinct was a fantasy. It was real, and it was documented, but it belonged elsewhere in the empire. Sanford's American pencil lines were indeed moved toward Mexico and China in these years, in exactly the pattern the angry version imagines. The instinct the brief reaches for existed. It simply did not fall on King's Lynn in the way the legend claims. The Norfolk works was not sacrificed to a Chinese factory. It was rationalized, folded into other English plants by a corporation tidying its portfolio, closing one door and opening another a couple of 100 miles away. The wrong version takes hold so easily because it matches everything we have watched happen to British making across half a century. We have seen the shipyards go, and the pits, and the mills, and the great car plants, and we have watched the containers come the other way, full of things once made here. The story of the American giant that buys the British brand and ships the work to China is true so often that it has become the default, the shape the mind reaches for before the facts are in. And so a factory that was in truth closed and dispersed within England gets remembered as one more thing sent east. The pattern is real. King's Lynn was simply not an instance of it. It was an instance of something quieter and, in its way, more modern still. The frictionless shuffling of production between a corporation's own sites, work treated as a liquid to be poured wherever the vessel is cheapest, with no thought of the ground it drains away from. Does that make it better? For the 230 people in King's Lynn who lost their livelihoods, not in the slightest. A job lost is a job lost, whether the work goes to Shenzhen or to Staffordshire. But it makes it a different kind of tragedy, quieter, greyer, more ordinary, and in its way, more damning. There was no dramatic villainy here, no midnight decision to betray a nation. There was a spreadsheet and a division that needed to be more efficient, and a factory that happened to be the one that could be closed. The people who made that decision were not monsters. They were managers, doing what the structure they served was built to make them do. And that is the harder thing to sit with, that a good factory full of good people can be ended not by cruelty, but by the simple, grinding logic of a portfolio that has grown too large to feel anything at all. There is one last cruelty in the arithmetic, and it is the sort that only becomes visible with hindsight. Some of King's Lynn's work went to Newhaven, to the old Parker factory on the Sussex coast. It was meant to be a consolidation, a gathering of the work into surviving sites. But Newhaven was not safe either. The same owner that closed King's Lynn in 2003 would, a few years later, close Newhaven too. The lifeboat was taking on water even as the survivors climbed aboard. Chapter 9. Last Orders on the Line. 2003. The announcement came, as these announcements always do, from somewhere else, not from the floor, from above it and far away. There would have been a consultation. There always is, a period of weeks in which the outcome is already decided and everyone knows it, and the meetings happen anyway and people sit in rooms being told about the future of their working lives by managers relaying decisions taken by people they will never meet. 230 jobs. In a city the size of Birmingham, 230 jobs is a bad week's news. In King's Lynn, it was something heavier. This was not a place rich in the kind of steady, skilled indoor industrial work that Berol had brought. West Norfolk was not a prosperous corner of England. Parts of King's Lynn, in those years, ranked among the more deprived places in the whole of East Anglia. A factory that offered a proper wage and a proper trade was not easily replaced, and everyone in the town understood that. When Berol went, it did not just take 230 individual jobs, it took a chunk of the town's remaining industrial confidence with it. A redundancy is a strange, slow-moving kind of blow. It does not land all at once. First, there is the announcement, and the disbelief, and the small, desperate hope that the numbers might change, that it might be the other line, the other shift, not yours. Then, there is the letter. Then the working out of notice. Coming in each morning to a factory you already know is dying, doing the job carefully out of habit and pride, even as you box up the tools that make the job possible. Then the last day, and the handshakes, and the drive home. And then the Monday after, the empty Monday, with nowhere to be and a mortgage that does not care. For a man or woman in their 50s who had spent a working life on the King's Lynn lines, the question was not just where the next wage would come from, it was what, exactly, they were now supposed to be. A person who has made pencils skillfully for 30 years is a pencil maker. Take away the factory and you do not just take the income. You take the trade, the identity, the thing they were good at, and you hand them instead a gap on a form marked previous employment. Some found other work, some retrained. Some never really worked again in the way they had. The town absorbed them, as towns do, quietly, without much fuss, and the loss disappeared into 100 private households and stopped being news. Think about who those 230 were. Not executives, line workers, the women who had run the imprinting machines for 20 years, the men who mixed the cores and tended the extrusion presses and knew, by feel and by smell, when a batch was right. The people who had come in as school leavers when the factory was young and were now facing middle age, with a skill the world had decided it no longer needed done in Norfolk. Some of them had given the place their whole working lives. Some had followed a parent through the same gates. The machines were switched off, crated. Some were driven to Lichfield, some to Newhaven. The graphite dust settled for the last time and was not disturbed again. There is a particular indignity in watching your workplace dismantled around you. The machine you knew, its quirks, the way it ran hot on a Friday, the trick you had learned for coaxing it through a difficult batch, hoisted onto a lorry and driven off to be run by strangers in another county. The tools go on living. It is only the place, and the people, that stop. Somewhere in Staffordshire, a King's Lynn machine would carry on stamping pencils, and no one operating it would know or care that it had come from Norfolk, or that the hands which had tended it for years were now at home, wondering what to do with a Monday. Nobody has recorded what the last thing made at King's Lynn was, whether it was a pencil or a pen, whether anyone thought to keep it. In the great collapses of British industry, the last car at Longbridge, signed by the men who built it, there is sometimes a final object, a relic, a full stop that people can hold. King's Lynn does not seem to have had one, or, if it did, no one wrote it down. The last Berol pencil made in Norfolk was probably just a pencil, indistinguishable from the millions before it, boxed and shipped without ceremony, its maker not knowing it was the last. That is its own kind of sadness, not the drama of a famous closure, the quietness of an ordinary one. The brand did not die. That is the strange, hollow heart of it. The pens kept selling. Somewhere, in other factories, they were still being made. But King's Lynn was finished. The making had left the town, and the town would not get it back. And Berol was not the last of it. King's Lynn had other industry, and in the years around the Berol closure, the town watched more of it go. On the same industrial landscape stood the great Campbell's soup factory, a separate business with its own long history and its own much larger workforce, a different company, a different story, but part of the same slow retreat of making from a town that had once been promised growth. In January 2012, the tower that had marked the Campbell's site for decades was demolished. A landmark that generations had used to know they were nearly home came down in an afternoon. One factory is a misfortune. The steady loss of them, one after another, is something else. The quiet unmaking of an industrial town, each closure taken on its own terms, each explained by its own reasonable logic, until you look up one day and the skyline has changed, and the good jobs have thinned and the young people are looking elsewhere. Berol was one thread in that, an important one for the families it touched. But one thread. Back on Old Meadow Road, the extractors that had roared for 36 years fell silent. The cedar smell, which had been the smell of the building and of a working lifetime for the people inside it, began to fade from the empty air. A factory built for noise and movement and the endless forward motion of the line stood still, and on the Monday after the last Friday, the people who had spent their lives making the pens that Britain learned to write with did not come in. There was nothing to come in for. The gates on the Hardwick industrial estate were shut. The eagle that Daniel Berolsheimer had chosen to stand for freedom 147 years before and an ocean away had folded its wings over Norfolk for the last time. Chapter 10. Old Berol Court. A building outlives its purpose long before anyone decides what to do with it. After 2003, the Berol Works on Old Meadow Road stood empty. Berol House, it had been called. The name still on it, the eagle still faintly present in the town's memory of the place. For years it did what empty industrial buildings do. It waited. At one low point, it was misused as a dumping ground for illegal tires, the kind of quiet indignity that settles on a place once no one is watching over it anymore. A factory that had shipped pens to every school in the country, reduced to a shed full of somebody's rubbish. In 2014, a King's Lynn businessman bought the site, and there was talk of jobs returning to it. The local paper reported it as a hopeful story, which after 11 years of emptiness, it was. By 2018, the old works had been redeveloped, carved into a parade of trade counter and industrial units, under a new name that keeps the old one alive while emptying it of meaning. Old Berol Court. 6 units, roadside frontage, the sort of small commercial development you drive past without a second glance. The first tenant to move in was a pet centre. There is no need to draw a moral from that. A pet shop is an honest business, and the people who run it deserve their living as much as anyone. But it is hard to stand on that spot and not feel the distance travelled, from the place that made the nation's pencils to a unit selling dog food in the space of a single working lifetime. The brand, meanwhile, sailed on without its birthplace. Berol survives today under Newell Brands, as the conglomerate is now called, and you can still buy the red handwriting pen. It is sold as Berol by Papermate, one heritage name leaning on another, made abroad and imported. It was in 2010, after the closure of that Newhaven factory, that the last British-based Berol production ended and the brand became, in full, an imported good. The address that Berol now keeps in Britain is an office in Lichfield, not a factory, an address. And here the second thread of this story ties into the first, because Newhaven deserves its own moment. The Parker Pen factory there had its own long history, a plant that opened in the 1940s, that by the 1970s employed more than 1,000 people, that became the British home of the most famous pen name in the world, after a management buyout brought Parker's headquarters to the Sussex coast in 1986. Parker was bought by Gillette in 1993, and then, at the very end of 2000, sold along with the rest of Gillette's writing division to Newell Rubbermaid. The same owner, the same division, the same portfolio that already held Berol. In July 2009, Newell Rubbermaid announced that the Newhaven factory would close, with the loss of up to 180 jobs, and that Parker production would move to France, to a plant near Nantes. The local Member of Parliament, Norman Baker, called it a bitter blow for the town, and said it was the end of an era. He was right on both counts. The factory shut over the following year or so. And there is the offshoring the angry version of the Berol story was looking for. It happened. A beloved British writing brand did have its factory closed by an American corporation, and its production moved abroad. But it was Parker, not Berol. It was France, not China. And it was 2009, not 2010. The two stories are not the same story. They are sequential links in one long chain of rationalisation. King's Lynn folded partly into Newhaven, and then Newhaven itself folded into France. The work moving on, always towards somewhere cheaper, always away from the hands that used to do it. What remains, then, is not the factory. The factory is a pet shop and 5 other units. What remains is the object and the memory. The objects are still out there. Charisma colour pencils, long discontinued, change hands among artists for more than they ever cost new, and in the National Trust's collections, catalogued and preserved, there is a single Berol Venus drawing pencil, stamped in silver with the words that say everything about where this thing came from and what it meant. Berol Limited, King's Lynn and London. A pencil, kept in a museum collection because someone understood it was worth keeping. There is one final irony, and it belongs to London, not Norfolk. On the site of the old Tottenham factory, the North London works where Eagle made pencils from before the First World War until 1992, developers have built flats and workspaces, and they have called the place the Berol Quarter. Their marketing celebrates the distinctive yellow Berol pencil as a true icon of the site's heritage. In London, the name sells flats. In King's Lynn, the name is over a row of trade units, and the first tenant sold pet supplies. The brand has become a thing developers reach for, a piece of borrowed authenticity, while the people who actually made the pencils have no plaque, no memorial, nothing but their own memories and a few photographs shared in local groups online. That is where the King's Lynn story really survives now. Not in any museum or archive, but in the recollections of the people who were there, gathering on social media to name faces in old works, photographs, to remember a supervisor, a Christmas do, the smell of the place. It is a fragile kind of remembering. It lasts only as long as the people do. When the last of the King's Lynn workforce is gone, the lived memory of what that factory was, the noise of it, the community of it, the particular pride of making the nation's pencils in a Norfolk town, will go with them, and all that will be left is the brand on an imported pen and a pencil in a museum drawer, and a row of units with a borrowed name. The pen outlived the people who made it. That is the whole of it, in a sentence. The red pen is still in the pot, still sold, still handed to children learning to write, and the Norfolk works that made it, and the 230 men and women who were there at the end, have been quietly folded away into a story most of the country never knew, about a factory most of the country could not have placed. So perhaps the only thing left to ask is the thing this story keeps circling. What do we owe the places that made the ordinary objects we remember? Not the famous ones, the everyday ones. The pen in the pot, the pencil worn to a shine, the smell of cedar in a classroom on a wet afternoon. Somebody made those things. They made them in a real building, in a real town, with real hands. And when the making went away, it went away like this, not with a betrayal, but with a calculation. Not to China, but up the A road. Not all at once, but a shift at a time, until the gates closed on the Hardwick estate, and nobody came in on the Monday. The pencils are still here, sharpen one, and the shaving still curls, and the cedar still rises, and for a moment the whole of it is in the air again. Fürth and Yonkers and Tottenham and the Fens, an eagle and an ocean, and a town on the Wash that made the nation's pencils, and then, quietly, stopped.